Good morning. I'm so glad you could be with me today as we continue our study of the book of Daniel, the first few chapters in the Unfolding the Word studies together. We're in the midst of chapter 2. I'm going to pick up our reading in chapter 2, verse 1 on through verse 6. In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was troubled, his sleep left him. And then the king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans, all of the Magi order, in other words, be summoned to tell the king his dreams. And so they came in and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I've had a dream, and my spirit's troubled to know the meaning. And then the Chaldean said to the king in Aramaic, Well, O king, live forever, tell the servants your dream, and then we'll tell you the interpretation. But the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, The word from me is firm. If you do not make known to me both the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses shall be laid in ruins. But if you show the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore show me the dream and its interpretation. As you remember, as we've been in this second chapter for a couple of days now, we're talking about a brand new crisis for Daniel and his friends who had just lived through the childhood crisis of exile and uprootedness, being taken away as slaves to Babylon. God sent King Nebuchadnezzar, this astounding king and respected leader, he had sent him a prophetic dream. And as we saw yesterday, it was a dream about God's plan for history. Its intention was to underscore the fact, that God is the Lord of history, that history is his story, that it is God, not man, that determines the future. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, being sharp, understood that when he got this dream, it was not a normal dream. He knew it had some significance to him. He sensed that it was important to his kingdom and to his own future. He realized he needed the answer to it, and he couldn't rest until he got an answer. Now that brings us to our verses today as he turns to the Magi order. And as he gathers the Magi order, his intelligentsia, his think tank, so to speak, and he draws them into his presence, he places an impossible demand upon them. What was going on in this impossible demand? Nebuchadnezzar, being smart, knew that people play games. What do I mean by that? He didn't want the Magi to play games with him, to hear some things that he would tell them about his dream, and then they themselves take that and do something with it. He wanted to ensure that didn't happen. And so the way that he thought to best achieve this is, I'm not going to tell them the dream. I'm going to say, first of all, you've got to tell me what I dreamed. Then, if you're successful in doing that, I'll give you a chance to interpret that dream for me. I guess the bottom line here is that Nebuchadnezzar was sharp, and he wasn't interested in human ideas and human speculation. He was sharp enough to know that that led nowhere ultimately. He needed more than speculation, more than human reasoning. He needed revelation. He needed some sort of clear insight as to the nature of the dream and what the dream was all about. And so he creates this impossible demand on the Magi order. Interpret the dream, but first tell me the dream. No one's going to be able to fake an answer in the king's mind. If they can't tell me the dream, they don't even get a chance to answer. But if they've told me the dream, I'll have some respect for them, and maybe I'll listen and try to make sense out of what they have to tell me. If you can tell me the dream. Now, how often has that been given to someone? It's one thing to say, hey, I had this dream, what do you think it means? And tell the people the dream. It's another thing to say, I had this dream, I need to know what it means, but I'm not going to tell you what the dream is. You've got to tell me what the dream was. By the way, the Magi were sharp, and they knew right away the king was making an impossible demand on them. They couldn't do it, and as we'll see tomorrow, they asked for more time. They asked that the king would give them that. It was his filtering process, a brilliant filtering process. It's how you make sure you don't get any human ideas here, that somehow you're connecting to where real truth is found. And he makes this combined promise and threat to the Magi order. If you interpret the dream properly, there's going to be a good outcome. If you interpret it not, if you can't interpret, there's going to be a bad outcome. If you succeed, if you're able to tell me the dream and then tell me what it means, you will have riches. You will have power, even more than you've got in this special elite group within the empire. And you will have honor. I will ensure that all of those things happen to you. And for human beings, most of whom are driven by desire for riches, for esteem of other people, and for power, those are pretty amazing offers, aren't they? And so he says, Magi, you're going to have your future made if you can address this question and this need that I have. But then he went on and he said, if you can't do this, then I'm requiring of you, you will be cut to pieces, torn to pieces. Notice how he puts it. If you don't make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you'll be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be laid in ruins. By the way, what does that mean, torn limb from limb? Well, we know from history that one of the forms of execution that was used by the Babylonians in special cases where some real point was wanting to be made, they would pull down with ropes 4 different trees and hold, and the person who was going to be executed would have ropes tied to their arms and to their legs, 1 rope for each limb to these different trees. Then when the signal was given that the thing that was the holding down of these trees and bending over the trees would be released, the trees would spring back with the power of the tree, and it would just rip the person's arms and legs off of their body. A pretty graphic form of execution. You know, the Romans had crucifixion as a graphic form of execution. This is what they did in Babylon. Now, most people weren't killed that way, but some were. And he's laying this out for the Magi, and he said, listen, if you can't tell me what I'm after, you're going to be torn limb from limb. And these people would have seen this happen at some point. And so this would have been a very real threat and a very sobering threat. And by the way, he says, then also your houses will be laid in ruins. The other thing that they did in Babylon is they would go to the neighborhood where somebody's house was. If they had been given this type of a punishment, their house would be razed to the ground. Think about it in today's culture. If this person who was convicted of this crime and it was a death penalty crime and they were killed, the government would go in and just bulldoze the house down. So every time you walk down the street, you'd look at this empty lot with a bulldozed down house, and that would be your reminder that the government means business. That's what was happening. You follow it? Added pressure. And he then builds even more, and he says, listen, you're the cream of the crop of the Magi, and those are the ones I've called in here. But I want you to know, not only will you die, the entire order will die. Everyone who's in it will face this result. And you know, there were some new members of this Magi order. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were the ones who had passed their orals before the king with flying colors about a year before this. Most of the leaders probably didn't know them to speak of. They were in the lower echelons of the Magi order. But they were facing death themselves. How's this for a pressure situation? And how's this for an affirmation that Nebuchadnezzar understood the seriousness of the dream, and he had to have an answer? While he was a rebel against God at this part of his life, he had to have an answer. All people need an answer. And brothers and sisters, there is no answer except God's answer, whether it's to the dream or whether it's to life, or whether it's to the solution to our sin, or whether it's to eternal life. There's only one who has the answer. And everyone desperately needs that answer. Well, join me tomorrow as we continue to examine this and look at the Magi's response to these impossible pressures that were left on them. God bless.